On a frozen January morning in 1958, Margaret Patterson pushed through the heavy doors of Washington Memorial Hospital, her white nursing shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floors as she began another 12-hour shift. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like persistent insects. She believed that day would unfold like any other, filled with routine patient care, medication rounds, and the endless paperwork that defined modern nursing. She was wrong. Within 48 hours, Margaret would find herself at the center of one of the most significant espionage discoveries of the Cold War, a revelation that would transform her understanding of trust, duty, and the invisible war being waged in the shadows of American hospitals. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Margaret Patterson had been a registered nurse for 7 years, having graduated from the George Washington University nursing program in 1951. At 32 years old, she represented the new generation of professional nurses who had benefited from the post-war expansion of nursing education. Unlike her predecessors, who had trained primarily in hospital-based diploma programs, Margaret held a bachelor's degree and approached her work with a scientific rigor that had become the hallmark of modern nursing practice. Washington Memorial Hospital, where Margaret worked, was a mid-sized facility with 240 beds, serving a diverse population in the nation's capital. The hospital had recently undergone expansion, thanks to funding from the Hill-Burton Act, which had pumped federal money into hospital construction across the country after World War II. The medical surgical unit where Margaret worked occupied the entire 4th floor, and she had seen everything from routine appendectomies to complex cardiac cases in her years there. The patient who would change her life arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late January. Margaret was reviewing charts at the nurses' station when Dr. Harold Jennings approached with a manila folder in his hands. Dr. Jennings was a respected internist in his mid-50s, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to diagnose obscure conditions. "He's in room 417, Dr. Jennings said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had been on call for 36 hours straight. Admitted through the emergency department around 2 this afternoon, presenting with severe pneumonia, possibly complicated by pleurisy. Name is Viktor Petrov. Says he's an engineer working for a consulting firm downtown." Margaret took the chart and scanned the admission notes. The patient was listed as 41 years old, originally from New York City, though his accent, as noted by the admitting physician, suggested Eastern European origins. His vital signs showed a temperature of 103.4 degrees, elevated respiratory rate, and decreased oxygen saturation. The chest radiograph revealed significant infiltrates in both lungs. "He'll need close monitoring," Dr. Jennings continued, rubbing his eyes beneath his wire-rimmed glasses. "High-dose penicillin, oxygen therapy, and I want vital signs checked every 2 hours. He's quite ill, Margaret. We almost sent him directly to the intensive care unit, but those beds are full with post-operative cardiac patients." Margaret nodded, making notes in the margin of the chart. She had nursed countless pneumonia patients through the years, especially during the winter months, when respiratory infections swept through the city like an invisible plague. The introduction of antibiotics had revolutionized treatment, but pneumonia remained a serious condition that could quickly turn fatal if not properly managed. When Margaret entered room 417 for the first time, she found her patient propped up in bed, struggling to breathe despite the oxygen flowing through the nasal cannula. Viktor Petrov was a lean man with sharp features and pale skin that glistened with fever sweat. His dark hair was damp and matted against his forehead, and his eyes, a striking grey-blue, tracked her movement across the room with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone so ill. "Good afternoon, Mr. Petrov," Margaret said, her voice adopting the warm but professional tone she used with all her patients. "I'm Margaret Patterson, and I'll be your primary nurse during the day shift. I'm going to check your vital signs and make sure you're as comfortable as possible." "Thank you, nurse," Petrov replied, his voice rough and labored. Each word seemed to cost him effort, and he paused frequently to catch his breath. "You are very kind. I apologize for the trouble I cause." His accent was definitely foreign, though Margaret couldn't place it precisely. It carried the heavy consonants and slight sibilants that suggested Russian or perhaps Polish origins. In 1958 Washington, with Cold War tensions running high, Russian accents weren't uncommon. The city hosted numerous diplomats, trade representatives, and immigrant families who had fled communist regimes. The presence of a foreign accent in itself meant nothing. Margaret went about her assessment with practiced efficiency, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm, timing his respirations and listening to his chest with her stethoscope. His lungs crackled with fluid, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. She noted everything in the chart, adjusting his oxygen flow slightly to improve his saturation levels. Over the next 3 days, Margaret cared for Viktor Petrov with the same diligence she brought to all her patients. She administered his antibiotics precisely on schedule, monitored his fluid intake and output, helped him with meals when he was too weak to feed himself, and changed his sweat-soaked bedding multiple times per shift. Nursing in the 1950s had evolved beyond simple bedside care. It required scientific knowledge, clinical judgment, and the ability to detect subtle changes in a patient's condition that might signal improvement or deterioration. Viktor Petrov was a model patient in many ways. He never complained, always expressed gratitude for the smallest kindnesses, and seemed genuinely apologetic about the burden his illness placed on the nursing staff. Yet something about him nagged at Margaret's instincts, though she couldn't articulate exactly what troubled her. It began with small observations, the kind of details a less experienced nurse might have missed. Despite his severe illness, Petrov seemed unusually alert and aware of his surroundings. Most patients with high fevers and significant respiratory distress appeared disoriented or exhausted, but Petrov tracked the comings and goings of staff members with keen attention. His eyes would follow conversations in the hallway, and Margaret noticed he seemed particularly interested when doctors discussed other patients or hospital operations. On the 3rd day of his hospitalization, Margaret entered his room to find him sitting up in bed, writing in a small leather-bound notebook. When he saw her, he quickly closed it and slipped it beneath his pillow, offering an apologetic smile. "Just keeping journal," he explained, his breathing somewhat improved but still labored. "My family in New York, they worry about me. I write to them to tell them I'm getting better thanks to excellent care." Margaret smiled and proceeded with her assessment, but the incident stuck with her. Something about the quickness of his movement, the almost reflexive way he had hidden the notebook, seemed inconsistent with a man simply writing letters to concerned relatives. That afternoon, as Margaret was documenting her nursing notes at the station, she overheard a conversation between 2 physicians discussing the hospital's recent installation of a new electrocardiogram machine. The device, manufactured by a company with defense contracts, represented the latest in cardiac monitoring technology. It was a point of pride for Washington Memorial, placing them at the forefront of medical innovation. What Margaret found curious was Viktor Petrov's reaction when one of the physicians stopped by his room later that evening to check on him. Margaret was in the room, adjusting his intravenous line when Dr. Jennings mentioned the new equipment in passing, making small talk about the hospital's modernization efforts. "Fascinating," Petrov responded, his eyes suddenly more focused. "What company manufactures this machine? We have nothing so advanced in the small hospitals back in New York." The question seemed innocent enough, but something about the way he asked it, the intensity beneath the casual tone, set off alarms in Margaret's mind. She filed the observation away, adding it to the growing collection of small inconsistencies that troubled her. By the 4th day, Petrov's condition had improved significantly. His fever had broken, his oxygen saturation had normalized, and he was breathing much easier. Dr. Jennings was pleased with his progress and mentioned that if improvement continued, he might be discharged within another 2 or 3 days. That same evening, Margaret was working late catching up on documentation after a particularly busy shift. Most of the floor was quiet, with patients settled for the night, and only the skeleton crew of night shift nurses beginning their rounds. Margaret needed to retrieve a form from the storage room near Petrov's room, and as she passed his door she heard voices. She wouldn't normally have paused. Respecting patient privacy was fundamental to nursing ethics, but something about the tone of the conversation made her stop. Petrov was speaking in a language she didn't understand, but the cadence and sound were distinctly Russian. His voice carried none of the labored quality it had when he spoke English. It was animated, urgent, and completely unhindered by respiratory distress. Margaret's heart began to pound. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but her instincts screamed that something was wrong. Very carefully, she moved closer to the door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the crack, she could see Petrov sitting up in bed, the telephone receiver pressed to his ear, speaking rapidly in Russian. His entire demeanor had changed. The grateful, apologetic patient had vanished, replaced by someone who spoke with authority and precision. She couldn't understand the words, but she caught fragments that sounded like numbers and technical terms. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Even with her limited knowledge of Russian, she recognized certain words that had become familiar to all Americans in the 1950s through news reports and civil defense preparations. She heard what sounded like nuclear, submarine, and navy. Margaret backed away from the door as quietly as possible, her mind racing. She could be completely wrong. He could be a Russian immigrant discussing completely innocent matters with family back home. The words she thought she recognized could mean something entirely different in context. But every instinct she had developed over 7 years of nursing told her that something was terribly wrong with this patient. She returned to the nurse's station and sat down, trying to organize her thoughts. What exactly had she observed? A patient who seemed unusually alert despite severe illness. A man who had hidden a notebook when she entered his room. Someone who had shown unexpected interest in the hospital's new medical equipment, particularly devices manufactured by companies with defense contracts. And now a supposedly sick man speaking fluently and energetically in Russian, using words that sounded related to national security. Margaret knew that hospital personnel were supposed to report suspicious activities, especially in Washington, where government security was paramount. But she also knew that making false accusations, especially against someone based on their nationality or accent, was exactly the kind of paranoia that had led to the excesses of the McCarthy era just a few years earlier. She had no desire to ruin an innocent man's life based on vague suspicions and overheard fragments of a language she didn't speak. She decided she needed more information before taking any action. Margaret was scheduled to work the next 3 days, and she resolved to observe Petrov more carefully, to look for concrete evidence that would either confirm or dispel her concerns. The following morning, Margaret arrived early and reviewed Petrov's chart thoroughly. She noted that his listed employer, Consolidated Engineering Associates, had provided insurance information and emergency contact details. His address was listed as an apartment building in Northwest Washington. Everything appeared normal and properly documented. During morning rounds, Margaret paid special attention to Petrov's belongings, which sat neatly organized on the bedside table. There was the leather notebook she had seen before, along with a wallet, a watch, and a small transistor radio. When Petrov excused himself to use the bathroom, Margaret quickly glanced at the identification in his wallet. His driver's license listed a New York address and showed a photograph that matched the man in the bed. His social security card appeared authentic. Everything seemed legitimate, but Margaret had learned to trust her instincts. Throughout that day, she made excuses to enter Petrov's room more frequently than strictly necessary. She noticed that he received no visitors, which seemed odd for someone supposedly living in the area with an employer concerned enough to provide comprehensive insurance coverage. He made several phone calls, always speaking English when staff were present, but she caught him twice speaking what she now believed was Russian when he thought he was alone. On the 6th day of Petrov's hospitalization, something happened that transformed Margaret's suspicions into certainty. She was delivering morning medications when she noticed a man in a dark suit standing outside Petrov's room, studying the room number. He didn't appear to be a doctor or a hospital administrator. There was something careful and deliberate about the way he surveyed the hallway before entering. Margaret busied herself at the nurse's station, but kept the room in her peripheral vision. The man emerged after only 3 minutes, walking briskly toward the elevators without the casual demeanor of a friendly visitor. Margaret made a split-second decision. She told the other nurse on duty that she needed to follow up on a supply issue and hurried to the stairwell, taking the stairs down as quickly as her shoes would allow. She reached the lobby just in time to see the man in the dark suit exit through the main doors. He walked to a dark sedan parked in a loading zone, and before he drove away, Margaret memorized the license plate number. She had no idea what she would do with this information, but something about the entire encounter felt wrong. Legitimate visitors didn't behave this way. Margaret returned to the fourth floor, her mind spinning with possibilities. She needed to talk to someone, but who? Going to hospital administration with vague concerns about a patient seemed like a recipe for embarrassment at best, and potential disciplinary action at worst. She couldn't go to the police without something more concrete than a foreign accent and suspicious behavior. That evening, Margaret did something she had never done in her 7 years of nursing. She called her older brother, James, who worked as an analyst for the State Department. James had served in Army intelligence during World War II and maintained contacts in the intelligence community. If anyone would know how to handle her suspicions, it would be him. They met for coffee at a diner near DuPont Circle, far from the hospital. Margaret laid out everything she had observed over the past 6 days, from the small inconsistencies in Petrov's behavior to the overheard phone conversation to the strange visitor. She gave James the license plate number she had memorized. James listened without interrupting, his face growing increasingly serious. When Margaret finished, he sat back and studied her carefully. "Maggie," he said, using the childhood nickname he rarely employed anymore, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you're describing sounds like it could be legitimate counterintelligence concerns, or it could be nothing. But either way, you need to report this through proper channels." He pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "This is a contact at the FBI field office here in Washington. His name is Special Agent Robert Callahan, and he handles matters like this. I'm going to call him tonight and give him a heads up that you'll be contacting him tomorrow. You need to tell him everything you've told me." "James," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "what if I'm wrong? What if this man is just a sick engineer from New York and I'm about to ruin his life because I watched too many propaganda films?" Her brother reached across and squeezed her hand. "Then the FBI will investigate, find nothing, and the matter will be closed. But Maggie, in our current world, we can't afford to ignore potential security breaches. The intelligence services of the Soviet Union are extremely active in Washington. They recruit agents, they gather information, and they use whatever cover seems most convenient. A sick patient in a hospital has access to all sorts of people and information, and nobody questions why he's there or what he's doing." Margaret spent a sleepless night considering her options. By the time she arrived at work the next morning, she had made her decision. During her lunch break, she walked to a payphone in the hospital lobby and called the number James had given her. Within an hour, Special Agent Callahan had arrived at the hospital and was meeting with her in a small conference room normally used for family consultations. Special Agent Callahan was a trim man in his early 40s with sharp eyes and a manner that managed to be both reassuring and intensely focused. He took notes as Margaret recounted everything she had observed, asking clarifying questions, but never making her feel foolish for her concerns. "Miss Patterson," he said when she finished, "I want you to know that you've done the right thing in coming forward. I can't tell you much about ongoing investigations, but I can say that the name Viktor Petrov has appeared in connection with some of our counterintelligence work. We've been trying to locate him for several weeks." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "So he is a spy?" "I didn't say that," Agent Callahan replied carefully. "What I said is that his name has come up in our investigations. I need you to continue your normal duties and not do anything that would alert Petrov that he's under suspicion. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "What happens now?" "Now," the agent said, "we conduct a proper investigation. We'll verify the information you've provided, confirm the identity of his visitor, and determine whether Mr. Petrov is who he claims to be. In the meantime, I need you to document anything unusual you observe, but I cannot stress this enough. Do not put yourself at risk. If this man is involved in espionage, he is potentially dangerous." Over the next 48 hours, Margaret maintained her professional demeanor with Petrov, administering medications, checking vital signs, and providing care exactly as she would for any other patient. But now she was aware that she was being watched as well. She noticed men in suits consulting with hospital administrators, and she saw plainclothes officers stationed discreetly in the hallways. Petrov seemed to sense that something had changed. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He made fewer phone calls and spent long hours simply staring out the window of his room. Margaret wondered if he knew that his cover had been compromised. On the 8th day of Petrov's hospitalization, Margaret arrived for her shift to find the 4th floor in controlled chaos. Security personnel had cordoned off room 417, and FBI agents were photographing and cataloging everything in the room. Dr. Jennings stood near the nurse's station, looking shaken and bewildered. "What happened?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They arrested Petrov this morning," Dr. Jennings said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The FBI. They said he's been operating under a false identity, that he's actually a Soviet intelligence officer named Mikhail Volkov. Apparently, he's been using his time in the hospital to coordinate meetings with agents and collect information about medical technology being developed for military applications." Margaret felt the room spin slightly. Despite her suspicions, hearing the confirmation was overwhelming. She had nursed, cared for, and trusted a man who had been lying about everything, who had been using his illness as cover for espionage activities. Agent Callahan appeared at her side, his expression grave but not unkind. "Miss Patterson, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They walked to the same conference room where they had first met. The agent gestured for her to sit, and then took the chair across from her. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said. "Your observations and your willingness to come forward have been instrumental in rolling up a significant Soviet intelligence operation. Petrov, or rather Volkov, has been operating in Washington for almost 2 years. He's been coordinating a network of agents focused on acquiring information about defense-related medical technology, particularly equipment being developed for use in submarines and battlefield hospitals." Margaret's mind flashed to the conversation she had overheard between the physicians about the new electrocardiogram machine. The hospital was indeed. "You mean he was collecting information from hospitals?" "Not just hospitals," Agent Callahan explained. "He targeted medical equipment manufacturers, research laboratories, and hospital procurement offices. The beauty of his approach was that medical facilities are relatively open environments. People don't expect espionage in a place dedicated to healing. His cover as a sick patient gave him access, mobility, and an excuse to be in various hospitals without raising suspicion. But he really was sick," Margaret said, remembering the fever, the labored breathing, the genuine symptoms of severe pneumonia. That wasn't faked. "No," Agent Callahan confirmed. "He had developed pneumonia, which actually complicated his intelligence operations. His handlers debated whether to extract him immediately or have him seek treatment as an opportunity to access Washington Memorial specifically. They chose to use his illness, which turned out to be a mistake because it brought him to your attention." Margaret processed this information slowly. The implications were staggering. All hospitals, with their vulnerable patients and trusting staff, could be targets for espionage. The very openness that made them effective healing institutions made them security risks in a world of Cold War tensions. "What will happen to him now?" Margaret asked. "That's a matter for the Department of Justice," Agent Callahan replied, "but I can tell you that his arrest will likely lead to a significant diplomatic incident. The Soviet embassy is already making inquiries, and there will probably be an exchange at some point. That's how these things typically work." Over the following weeks, Margaret learned more about the case from carefully worded news reports. Viktor Petrov was indeed Mikhail Volkov, a captain in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. He had been operating under deep cover in the United States for nearly 3 years, first in New York and then in Washington. His network had successfully acquired specifications for several pieces of medical technology with potential military applications, including portable X-ray equipment designed for field hospitals and advanced cardiac monitoring devices being developed for submarine crews. The arrest of Volkov led to the identification of 3 other Soviet agents operating in Washington, all of whom were quietly expelled through diplomatic channels. The case was handled with relative discretion, neither government wanting to escalate tensions during an already delicate period in Cold War relations. Margaret found herself briefly famous within the intelligence community, though her identity was carefully protected from public disclosure. She received a commendation letter from the director of the FBI, praising her vigilance and patriotism. But the experience had changed her in ways that went beyond official recognition. She began to see her profession differently. Nursing had always been about healing, about providing care to vulnerable people in their greatest time of need. But now she understood that caregiving existed within a larger context, one where trust could be weaponized and vulnerability could be exploited. It was a sobering realization that made her approach her work with a new wariness. In the months that followed, Margaret participated in several meetings with hospital administrators and federal officials about improving security protocols without compromising patient care. It was a delicate balance. Hospitals needed to remain open and accessible to function effectively, but they also needed to be aware that in a world of Cold War espionage, no institution was entirely safe from infiltration. The head of nursing at Washington Memorial, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, called Margaret into her office 3 months after Volkov's arrest. Mrs. Whitmore was a formidable woman in her 60s who had trained during World War I and had seen nursing evolve through decades of profound change. "Miss Patterson," Mrs. Whitmore said, settling into her chair with the careful precision of someone whose back had been worn down by decades of long shifts, "I want to discuss what happened with the Petrov case and what it means for our nursing staff going forward." Margaret nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading. "What you did required considerable moral courage," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "You saw something that troubled you, and despite uncertainty and despite the risk of being wrong, you acted on your professional judgment. That is the hallmark of an excellent nurse. But I also want to be clear about something. We cannot allow paranoia to infiltrate our hospitals. We cannot treat every patient with a foreign accent or unusual behavior as a potential security threat." "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "I never wanted to create that impression." "I know you didn't," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her stern expression softening slightly. "But I'm telling you this because the hospital administration has been pressuring us to implement screening procedures for all patients, particularly those with foreign backgrounds. I've been resisting this because it goes against everything we stand for as a healing profession. We treat everyone equally, regardless of nationality, politics, or background." She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Margaret with intensity. "What you did was observe a patient's behavior and note inconsistencies that suggested something was amiss. You didn't profile him based on his accent or his nationality. You used clinical judgment and nursing intuition developed over years of practice. That's the distinction we must maintain." Margaret felt a wave of relief. She had worried that her actions might lead to discriminatory policies that would harm innocent patients. Mrs. Whitmore was right. The key was not to suspect everyone, but to maintain the professional awareness that had always been part of good nursing practice. Life gradually returned to normal, though Margaret found that her experience had given her a reputation among her colleagues. Some nurses sought her out to discuss their own concerns about unusual patient behaviors, though most of these turned out to be misunderstandings or personality conflicts, rather than espionage. Margaret always listened carefully, but she also urged her colleagues to remember that their first duty was to patient care, not counterintelligence. One afternoon in late summer, almost 6 months after Volkov's arrest, Margaret received a phone call at the nurses' station. The voice on the other end identified himself as Deputy Director Foster from the FBI. "Miss Patterson," he said, his tone formal but not unfriendly, "I'm calling to inform you that Mikhail Volkov has been exchanged for 2 American intelligence officers who were being held in Moscow. The exchange took place this morning at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. I thought you deserved to know." Margaret thanked him for the information and hung up the phone. She felt an odd mixture of emotions. On one hand, she was pleased that American officers had been returned home. On the other, she knew that Volkov would likely resume his intelligence work, targeting other institutions in other countries, using his skills to exploit trust and access in pursuit of state secrets. That evening, Margaret walked home from the hospital as the sun set over Washington, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The city looked peaceful, with families sitting on their front stoops to escape the summer heat and children playing stickball in the streets. It was hard to believe that beneath this ordinary surface, An invisible war was being waged by intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Margaret thought about what she had learned from her encounter with Mikhail Volkov. She had learned that the Cold War was not just about missiles and military bases and diplomatic negotiations in far-off capitals. It was also about the individual choices made by ordinary people in ordinary places. It was about a nurse noticing that something didn't quite fit, about trusting professional instincts even when doing so felt uncomfortable and uncertain. She had also learned something about the nature of trust in a divided world. Trust was essential to human society, particularly in professions like nursing, where vulnerable people placed their lives in the hands of caregivers. But trust could not be absolute or unexamined. It had to be balanced with awareness, with the understanding that not everyone was who they claimed to be, and that some people would exploit trust for purposes that had nothing to do with healing or care. Over the years that followed, Margaret continued to work at Washington Memorial Hospital. She eventually moved into a supervisory role, training younger nurses and helping to develop protocols that balanced security concerns with the fundamental mission of providing compassionate care. She never spoke publicly about the Volkov case, respecting the discretion that intelligence work required. But privately, in quiet conversations with nursing students and young nurses beginning their careers, she would sometimes tell a version of the story, carefully edited to protect identities and classified details. She would talk about the importance of observation, about trusting your instincts when something didn't feel right, about the moral courage required to act on concerns even when you might be wrong. The Cold War would continue for another 30 years after Margaret's encounter with Mikhail Volkov, finally ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. During those decades, countless intelligence operations would unfold in the shadows, some successful and some failures, all part of the great ideological struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century. Margaret Patterson's role in this vast historical drama was tiny, a single moment in one hospital in one city. Yet her story illustrated a profound truth about the Cold War. It was not just fought by spies with secret codes and concealed weapons. It was also fought by ordinary citizens who chose to pay attention, to question what they saw, and to act with courage when circumstances demanded it. The lesson from her experience reached beyond the specific context of Cold War espionage. It spoke to the broader responsibility that professionals in all fields bear to maintain standards of awareness and ethical judgment. Nurses, teachers, engineers, administrators, everyone who works with vulnerable populations or sensitive information must balance trust with vigilance, compassion with caution. In the end, Margaret's discovery of Mikhail Volkov's true identity had prevented the compromise of military medical technology that might have given the Soviet Union advantages in battlefield medicine or submarine operations. The intelligence officers who were eventually exchanged for Volkov had been returned to their families and their country, and perhaps most importantly, the incident had reinforced the reality that in a world of competing ideologies and conflicting national interests, security was everyone's responsibility, not just that of intelligence professionals and military personnel. Margaret retired from nursing in 1986, after 35 years of service. By then, the profession had evolved dramatically. Intensive care units had become standard. Nursing education had moved almost entirely into colleges and universities, and specialized nurse practitioners were taking on roles that would have been unthinkable in the 1950s. Yet the fundamental essence of nursing remained unchanged. It was still about observing, caring, advocating for patients, and maintaining the trust that made healing possible. On her last day at Washington Memorial Hospital, the nursing staff threw a small retirement party in the break room. There were cake and punch and heartfelt speeches about her contributions to the profession. Several young nurses who had trained under her supervision spoke about the lessons she had taught them, about attention to detail and clinical judgment, and the courage to speak up when something seemed wrong. What they didn't know, what Margaret had never told most of them, was that many of those lessons had been forged in those 8 days in January 1958, when a patient named Viktor Petrov had taught her that healing and espionage could occupy the same hospital room, and that a nurse's greatest responsibility was not just to care for patients, but to remain aware of the larger world in which that care took place. The Volkov case had taught Margaret that patriotism was not just about waving flags or supporting military operations in distant countries. It was about paying attention to the world immediately around you, about questioning when things didn't add up, and about having the courage to act on your convictions, even when doing so felt uncomfortable or uncertain. These were lessons that transcended the specific circumstances of the Cold War and remained relevant in any era when security and freedom, trust and vigilance needed to be carefully balanced. As Margaret cleaned out her locker on that final day, she found a newspaper clipping she had saved from 1958. It was a brief article about increased security measures at hospitals in the Washington area following unspecified security concerns. The article never mentioned names or specific incidents, but Margaret knew the story behind those generic phrases. She had lived it. She looked at the faded newsprint and thought about how history is made up of countless small moments, individual decisions that collectively shape the larger narrative. Most people who contributed to the Cold War struggle did so anonymously, their stories never told publicly, their sacrifices and contributions known only to a small circle of colleagues and supervisors. Margaret had been one of those people, a nurse who had noticed something wrong and had acted on that observation, changing the course of events in ways both large and small. The Cold War had been full of dramatic moments: the Berlin airlift, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it had also been built on millions of smaller moments, quiet acts of vigilance and courage by ordinary people in ordinary places. Margaret Patterson's encounter with Mikhail Volkov was one such moment, a reminder that the great struggles of history are not just waged by presidents and generals, but also by nurses and teachers and office workers who choose to pay attention and to act when circumstances demand it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.